I stood beside my father's casket, ready to say my final goodbye, when my stepmother violently ripped the microphone from my hands. She smiled at the hundreds of wealthy guests and announced that I was a bastard who had faked my way into an $80 million family. She thought she had successfully erased me from his legacy right there on the altar. But she had no idea my father had left behind one legally binding DNA clause that was about to strip away her entire empire and leave her begging on her knees. The heavy oak doors of the private church were shut tight against the pouring rain, but inside the air felt suffocating. It smelled of expensive white lilies, polished mahogany, and the cold perfume of the city's commercial real estate elite. I adjusted the collar of my cheap off-the-rack suit. The fabric was stiff and uncomfortable against my neck, a stark contrast to the tailored designer clothing worn by the 300 guests sitting in the pews behind me. I am Harrison Caldwell. Most people call me Harry. I am 34 years old, and I work as a paramedic. I spend my nights pulling people out of wrecked cars and fighting to keep their hearts beating. But standing there at the front of that massive vaulted sanctuary staring at my father's closed casket, I felt completely helpless. My father, Richard Caldwell, built an $80 million empire from the ground up. He spent his life buying, developing, and selling the skyline of this city. Everyone in that room wanted a piece of his power. They were sharks in mourning clothes, politicians, bankers, and developers, all waiting to see who would take control of the throne. But I did not care about the money. I just wanted to read the eulogy I had written on a piece of folded notebook paper. I wanted to honor the man who used to take me fishing before the wealth entirely consumed his life. I stepped up to the polished wooden podium. The microphone picked up the sound of my ragged breathing. I placed my hands on the edges of the stand, my knuckles scarred and calloused from years of lifting stretchers, and looked down at my notes. Before I could even speak my first word, a shadow moved sharply to my left. Sylvia, my stepmother, stepped up onto the altar. She was 58 years old, draped from head to toe in flawless black silk, wearing a string of heavy, authentic pearls around her neck. For the past hour, she had been playing the role of the devastated widow, perfectly dabbing her dry eyes with a lace handkerchief and accepting the condolences of the billionaires who walked down the aisle. But as she approached me now, there were no tears. Her eyes were hard, calculating, and predatory. Before I realized what she was doing, Sylvia reached out and violently snatched the microphone right out of my hands. A loud, sharp screech of audio feedback echoed through the massive church, making several people in the front rows flinch. I froze, completely caught off guard. I looked at her confused, thinking, maybe her grief had overwhelmed her and she needed to speak first. But Sylvia did not look at the casket. She turned her body, looked me dead in the eye, and gave me a vicious, ice-cold smile. It was a smile of pure victory. Then she brought the microphone to her lips and addressed the silent, staring crowd. "You have no right to stand here," she said. Her voice rang out crystal clear through the sanctuary speakers echoing off the stained glass windows. "Richard was never your real father." The words hit me so hard I physically stepped back. The air was knocked completely out of my lungs. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. The entire church gasped in unison. 300 pairs of eyes locked onto me, wide with shock, confusion, and morbid curiosity. Sylvia did not stop. She reached into her expensive black designer clutch and pulled out a folded piece of thick white paper. She opened it and held it up like a trophy for the front rows to see. For 34 years, Sylvia announced, her voice rising with dramatic indignation, "This man and his mother have lived a lie. They manipulated my late husband. They preyed on his generous heart. I have right here in my hand an official laboratory DNA report. It proves without a shadow of a doubt that Harrison has absolutely zero biological connection to the Caldwell family." My heart hammered wildly against my ribs. The blood rushed to my face, burning my cheeks. "What are you doing?" I whispered, my voice shaking. "Sylvia, please. Not here. Not today." But my microphone was gone. Only the people in the very front could hear my desperate pleading. Sylvia ignored me entirely. She was commanding the room, playing the ultimate victim for the elite crowd. His mother was nothing but a liar and an opportunist. Sylvia continued, her tone dripping with venom. She trapped Richard into raising a child that belonged to another man. And you, Harrison, you are a parasite. You have been leeching off the Caldwell name your entire life. You took his money for your education. You took his time. You played the role of the grieving son today, waiting to get your hands on his estate. But the truth is finally out. Hearing her attack my late mother tore a hole right through the center of my chest. My mother was a kind, hard-working woman who died of cancer when I was 26. I had spent years drowning in $80,000 of medical debt, trying to save her, working double shifts on the ambulance just to afford her treatments. Sylvia knew that. She knew how much I sacrificed. But she was using my mother's memory as a weapon to destroy me in front of the most powerful people in the city. The whispers started immediately. I could hear the harsh, judging murmurs from the pews. I saw wealthy investors shaking their heads. I saw women whispering behind their hands. In a matter of 60 seconds, Sylvia had rewritten my entire existence. She had stripped away my father, my mother's honor, and my identity, replacing it all with a filthy, fabricated lie. I wanted to scream that the paper in her hand was a fake. I wanted to tell the crowd that Sylvia had spent the last 20 years trying to push me out of the family frame, slowly isolating my father, cutting off my phone calls, making sure I was never invited to the holiday dinners or the company galas. I wanted to tell them that I never asked my father for a single dime, that I worked brutally long hours to pay my own way through life because I refused to be a part of her toxic world. But I was standing there in a cheap suit, looking exactly like the desperate broke outsider she claimed I was, and she was the polished, wealthy widow holding a document that no one in the room was going to question. "Did you really think Richard loved you?" Sylvia asked, turning away from the crowd and lowering the microphone just enough so her voice was directed only at me, though it still carried through the silence of the altar. "He knew Harrison. Toward the end, he knew you were a fraud. That is why he let me handle the estate. You are nothing but a charity case that went on for far too long." My fists clenched at my sides. The fingernails dug deeply into my palms. The anger rising inside me was thick and blinding, but it was suffocating beneath the weight of the massive public humiliation. I looked down at the mahogany casket, hoping for some impossible miracle, hoping my father would sit up and tell them all she was lying. But he was gone. I was completely alone in a room full of wolves. Sylvia turned back to the crowd, her face suddenly shifting from righteous anger back to tragic sorrow. She placed a hand over her heart. "It breaks my soul to expose this tragedy on the day we are meant to celebrate Richard's life," she said, perfectly modulating her voice to sound deeply wounded. "But Richard built this legacy with his blood and sweat. I will not allow a stranger to stand at his casket and claim his name. I will not allow a thief to steal the future he intended for his true family." The congregation was entirely captivated by her performance. I could see the pity in their eyes, not for me, but for her. They believed every single word. Why wouldn't they? She belonged to their world. She spoke their language. I was just the paramedic who showed up in a discount suit. Sylvia stepped closer to me, invading my personal space. The scent of her expensive perfume was nauseating. "You are done here," she whispered, her voice a harsh, hateful hiss meant only for my ears. "You are a ghost. You will not get a single cent from this family. Now get off my altar before I have you arrested for trespassing." I stood frozen for a few agonizing seconds. The heavy silence in the church pressed down on my shoulders like a physical weight. The hundreds of faces staring at me blurred together into a sea of judgment and disgust. I looked at the crumpled piece of notebook paper in my hand. The eulogy I had spent 3 nights writing, pouring my heart out about the man who taught me how to ride a bike and tie my shoes. It was totally useless now. I swallowed the massive lump forming in my throat. I refused to give her the satisfaction of seeing me cry. I refused to let her break me down in front of these people. I slowly lowered my hands from the podium, folded the piece of paper, and put it inside my jacket pocket. I gave the casket one last lingering look, whispering a silent goodbye to the man who raised me, regardless of whatever fabricated piece of paper she held in her hand. Then, with my jaw clenched tight and my eyes burning, I turned and began the long, agonizing walk down the center aisle. Every step felt like walking through thick mud. The guests physically pulled back as I passed their pews, as if my poverty and my supposed betrayal were a contagious disease. No one offered a word of comfort. No one met my gaze. I heard the sharp cutting whispers following me all the way to the back of the sanctuary. I heard them calling me a disgrace, a con artist, a pathetic joke. Sylvia had orchestrated the ultimate public execution of my character, and she had executed it with flawless, terrifying precision. She had waited for the exact moment I was most vulnerable, standing next to my father's dead body, to strike her blow. She wanted to make absolutely sure that I was so thoroughly humiliated, so completely broken, that I would never dare to show my face near the Caldwell estate ever again. But as I pushed open the heavy oak doors of the church and stepped out into the freezing, pouring rain, I did not know that her cruel performance was only the first layer of the nightmare. I did not know that the absolute lowest point of my life was still waiting for me at home, or that my survival was about to be pushed to the absolute brink. All I knew in that moment was that the family I thought I had was dead, and the people who remained were determined to bury me right next to him. I walked down the concrete steps into the storm, the rain instantly soaking through my cheap suit. I did not run. I just walked toward my old car, carrying the devastating weight of Sylvia's lies. She thought she had won. She thought the fabricated DNA test was the ultimate weapon. But she was standing on a foundation built entirely on greed, and neither of us realized that my father had already set the trap that would eventually tear her entire world apart. The microphone and the lie were her opening moves, but the game was far from over. The silence in the massive sanctuary was absolute and suffocating. It was the kind of heavy quiet that follows a devastating explosion. My stepmother had just dropped a bomb on my entire existence, and the dust was settling over the polished mahogany pews. I stood frozen at the podium, the microphone entirely gone from my empty hands. The 300 guests, the wealthiest developers, bankers, and politicians in the city, stared at me with wide, horrified eyes. I could feel their judgment burning into my skin like physical fire. Before I could gather the breath to defend myself, a crisp, rhythmic sound broke the silence. It was the sound of expensive leather shoes striking the marble floor of the altar. Trent stepped forward from the front row. My 28-year-old half-brother moved with the casual, lazy confidence of a man who had never been told no in his entire life. He was dressed in a custom charcoal gray Tom Ford suit that probably cost more than I made in an entire year working on the ambulance. His blonde hair was perfectly styled, and a heavy gold watch slipped out from under his tailored cuff as he raised a hand to address the crowd. Trent was Sylvia's biological son, the golden child of the family. My father had handed him the chief operating officer title at the real estate firm right out of college, despite Trent spending most of his 20s partying on yachts and crashing imported sports cars. While I was pulling consecutive night shifts as a paramedic, dragging accident victims out of shattered windshields and trying to keep their hearts beating in the back of a rig, Trent was playing the role of the brilliant corporate heir. He had never built anything in his life. He had only ever collected what was handed to him. And right now he was stepping up to collect the rest of my father's empire. Trent did not look at me at first. He placed a comforting hand on his mother's shoulder, acting the part of the fiercely protective son. Sylvia leaned into him, letting out a perfectly timed trembling sob. The crowd practically melted with sympathy for her. Then Trent turned his head and locked his eyes on me. There was no grief in his face. There was only pure, unadulterated contempt. The smirk resting on his lips was so cold and dismissive it made my stomach turn. He looked at my worn-off-the-rack suit, taking in the frayed edges of my collar and the scuffed toes of my work shoes. He looked at me like I was an infestation that had finally been exposed to the harsh light of day. "I think you have caused my mother enough pain for one day," Trent said. His voice was smooth and practiced, projecting easily across the quiet church without the need for a microphone. He spoke with the authority of a man who already owned every brick and stained glass window in the building. "Trent," I said, my voice shaking with a mixture of rage and desperate disbelief. "You know this is a lie. You know Dad loved me. He raised me. You cannot do this today, not in front of his casket." Trent let out a sharp, mocking laugh that cut through the sacred space. "Loved you," he repeated, shaking his head as if I had just said something incredibly stupid. "My father tolerated you because he pitied your mother. He was a generous man, and you two took advantage of his charity for over 3 decades. But the free ride ends today. You are a fraud. You do not carry Caldwell blood, and you will not disrespect his memory by standing at his altar for another second." I took a step forward, my hands curling into tight fists. The sheer audacity of his lies made the blood roar in my ears. I wanted to grab him by the lapels of his custom suit. I wanted to force him to tell the truth in front of all these people. But before I could close the distance between us, Trent raised 2 fingers in the air. It was a simple, subtle gesture, a signal to the private security team lining the walls of the church. Trent leaned in close to me, bridging the gap just as the security guards reached the steps of the altar. He lowered his voice so only I could hear the absolute venom in his words. "Go back to your garbage truck, you bastard." Trent whispered, his breath hot against my face as he intentionally insulted my ambulance and my career. "We are erasing your name from the family trust before the sun sets. You are nothing. You get nothing." I did not even have time to process the sheer cruelty of the threat before a thick, muscular arm wrapped completely around my chest, pinning my arms to my sides. A second guard grabbed my left shoulder, his large hands digging brutally into my collarbone. These were not regular church ushers. They were massive, high-end corporate mercenaries, the kind of men my father used to hire to guard commercial construction sites. "Get your hands off me," I shouted, struggling against their massive weight. "I am his son. Let me go." But my protests were entirely useless. They were built like brick walls, and I was exhausted from a grueling night shift and completely hollowed out by grief. They yanked me backward, dragging my feet off the polished marble of the altar. I stumbled, my knees scraping against the wooden steps as they forcefully marched me down the center aisle of the church. The humiliation was absolute and suffocating. It felt like I was drowning in a sea of wealthy, judging eyes. As I was physically hauled past the rows of pews, I saw the faces of the people I had known for my entire life. These were my father's business partners, family friends, and neighbors. I had sat at dinner tables with them. I had shaken their hands at charity events. But now, under the influence of Sylvia's fabricated DNA test and Trent's commanding performance, they looked at me with open disgust. They physically pulled back as I was dragged past them. Women clutched their expensive purses to their chests, acting as if my poverty and my supposed betrayal were a contagious disease. Men shook their heads and muttered under their breath. I heard the word con artist whispered from a pew on my right. I heard someone else say it was a total disgrace that I had even shown my face at the funeral. I was completely, entirely erased. In the span of a few minutes, Sylvia and Trent had not just stolen my inheritance. They had stolen my identity. They had murdered my reputation in front of the entire city. My lungs burned as I tried to pull in air, but the grip of the security guards was too tight. I felt like a criminal being paraded through the town square. Every single step down that long carpeted aisle was a brutal strike against my dignity. The heavy oak doors at the back of the church loomed closer and closer. The guards did not loosen their iron grip for a single second. They shoved me through the vestibule, ignoring my desperate attempts to dig the heels of my shoes into the floor to slow them down. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would shatter my ribs. The sheer injustice of the moment burned like acid in my throat. I looked back one last time, hoping someone, anyone, would stand up and stop this madness. But no one moved. The elite crowd stood together, a solid wall of wealth and privilege completely shutting me out. One of the guards reached forward and pushed the massive brass handles of the front doors. The heavy oak swung open, and the freezing, violent storm outside instantly rushed into the church. The rain was coming down in thick, blinding sheets. The cold wind bit into my skin through my thin suit jacket, sending violent shivers down my spine. Before I could brace myself for the impact, the two massive security guards hoisted me forward and threw me out the door. I flew through the damp air and hit the wet concrete steps incredibly hard. My hands slammed against the rough stone, tearing the skin from my palms. My knees crashed onto the stairs, ripping the fabric of my cheap slacks and sending a jolt of sharp pain up my legs. I tumbled down 2 more steps before finally coming to a stop on the flooded, freezing sidewalk. I lay there for a second, gasping for breath as the icy rain instantly soaked me to the bone, chilling my blood. The pain shooting up my arms was sharp, but it was absolutely nothing compared to the agony tearing through my chest. I sat there on the cold, hard ground, the freezing water pasting my hair to my forehead and running down the back of my neck. I wiped the mixture of rain and blood from my hands onto my ruined trousers and slowly, painfully forced myself to stand up. My whole body trembled. The storm raged around me, drowning out the sounds of the city traffic. I turned around and looked back up the grand stone steps of the church. The 2 massive security guards stood perfectly still just inside the doorway, blocking any chance of re-entry. Their faces were completely blank, completely unbothered by the fact that they had just thrown a grieving son out into a torrential storm. They crossed their arms, staring down at me like I was a stray dog that had wandered too close to a mansion. Past their broad shoulders, through the thick, decorative glass panels of the heavy oak doors, I could still see the altar. The lighting inside the sanctuary looked incredibly warm and golden compared to the gray, miserable reality I was standing in. I walked slowly up the first few steps, my legs shaking, and pressed my bleeding, trembling hand against the freezing, wet glass. Through the blurred, rain-streaked panes, I watched the final act of their brilliant, evil performance. The crowd had rushed forward. Dozens of wealthy elites were crowding around the mahogany casket, not to mourn my father, but to comfort Sylvia. She was standing in the center of the altar, her face buried in a delicate handkerchief. She was playing the role of the weeping, devastated, and incredibly brave widow who had just saved her late husband's legacy from a terrible, scheming fraud. The billionaires patted her back. The politicians offered her soft words of condolences. Trent stood right beside her. He had his arm wrapped firmly around his mother's shoulders. He was nodding solemnly to the investors, shaking his hand. He looked like the perfect heir, the strong, responsible leader who had just protected the $80 million empire from an outside threat. They looked like a unified, flawless family, and I was completely invisible, standing out in the freezing rain, bleeding onto the concrete. I stared at the mahogany casket resting in the background, a sharp ache tearing through my throat. I just wanted to say goodbye to him. I just wanted to tell my father that I loved him, that I was grateful for the life he gave me before Sylvia built a wall between us. But they had taken that away from me too. They had taken my history, my dignity, and my right to grieve the only parent I had left. Through the glass, Trent briefly turned his head. Over the shoulders of the mourning crowd, his eyes met mine through the rain-slicked window. Even from that distance, I could see the cold, victorious smirk return to his face. He had won. He had the company, the money, the power, and the name. He looked at me with absolute triumph, silently telling me that my life as a Caldwell was officially over. Trent gave a sharp, subtle nod to the guard standing in the vestibule. The 2 massive men stepped back and grabbed the thick brass handles. Without a single word, they pulled the heavy oak doors together. The thick wood swung shut, cutting off the warm golden light. It cut off the sight of my father's casket. It cut off the faces of the people I used to know. And it cut me off completely from the only family I had ever belonged to. The doors slammed shut with a heavy, echoing thud that vibrated through the wet concrete beneath my feet. The sharp, mechanical click of the deadbolt locking echoed loudly in the storm, sealing my fate. I stood there alone on the flooded sidewalk, completely soaked, bleeding, and entirely abandoned. The rain washed over my face, hiding the hot tears of frustration and anger that I could no longer hold back. They had thrown me out into the street like garbage. They had stripped me of my name and my dignity. But as I stood shivering in the freezing wind, staring at those locked oak doors, a quiet, dangerous realization began to spark deep inside my chest. Sylvia and Trent thought they had permanently erased me. They thought their fabricated DNA document was the ultimate weapon that would secure their $80 million future and leave me destroyed forever. They had absolutely no idea that my father had seen right through their endless greed. They had no idea that the real game was just about to begin, and the golden ground they were standing on was already rigged to completely collapse beneath their feet. The drive back from the church was a blur of freezing rain and blinding headlights. The heater in my old Subaru had stopped working 2 winters ago, and the cold air blowing through the vents felt like ice against my wet skin. I gripped the worn steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My clothes were plastered to my body, heavy and dripping with the storm water, but the physical cold was absolutely nothing compared to the shock freezing my veins. Sylvia had just stripped me of my name. Trent had literally thrown me into the street. My entire history had been erased in front of the city elite in a matter of minutes. But as the windshield wipers dragged heavily across the glass, squeaking with every pass, I kept desperately telling myself one thing. I still had Chloe. We had been engaged for a year. We shared a small, cramped apartment on the edge of the city, far away from the Caldwell mansions and their toxic games. I thought we were building a real life together. I thought she loved me for the man I was, the paramedic who worked 70-hour weeks, the man who stayed up all night holding his dying mother's hand. I was foolish enough to believe that when I walked through our front door, she would wrap her arms around me, tell me she believed me, and say we would survive this nightmare together. I parked the car by the curb and ran through the torrential storm, taking the 3 flights of stairs to our apartment 2 at a time. I did not even care that I was tracking dirty rainwater onto the cheap hallway carpet. I just needed to see her face. I pushed my key into the lock, turned it, and shoved the door open. The apartment was dead silent except for the low, mocking sound of the television in the living room. I stepped inside, dripping rain onto the entryway linoleum, and that is when my heart dropped straight into my stomach. 2 large suitcases were sitting right by the front door. On top of them rested her expensive leather tote bag. The closet door down the hall was wide open and half the hangers were entirely empty. I stood there paralyzed, the freezing water dripping from my hair into my eyes. I looked toward the living room. Chloe was standing in the center of the room. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest. She was not crying. She was not worried. She was glaring at me with a level of disgust I had never seen before. Behind her, the television screen was playing a video on a constant loop. I recognized the heavy oak doors of the church. I recognized the stone steps. It was a video of me. 2 massive security guards were dragging me backward by my collar and throwing me onto the wet concrete. The camera shook slightly and I could hear Trent's voice in the background of the recording laughing and calling me a garbage truck driving bastard. He had actually had his private security film my brutal humiliation and leaked it directly to their wealthy social circles. And Chloe was watching it. I took a step forward, raising my trembling, bloodied hands. Chloe, I said, my voice cracking under the weight of the absolute nightmare this day had become. Please, it is not what it looks like, Sylvia lied. She ambushed me at the altar. She faked a DNA test to cut me out. Chloe did not move an inch. She just stared at my wet, ruined suit and the blood slowly dripping from my scraped palms onto the rug. She reached over to the coffee table and picked up her phone, the screen lighting up with dozens of notifications. My phone has been exploding for the past hour, she said. Her voice was completely hollow, completely devoid of any warmth or sympathy. Every single person we know has seen this video. The the wives of the board members, the people I work with at the firm. Everyone is sending me messages asking why my fiancé was thrown out of his own father's funeral like a stray dog. Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is for me? I tried to explain again. I told her that Sylvia orchestrated the whole thing to steal my inheritance to make sure I could not challenge her control of the family trust. I told her we needed to fight it together. We needed to get a lawyer and prove the DNA test was a fraud. I was begging the woman I loved to simply believe me, to stand by my side when I had literally nothing else left in the world. But Chloe let out a harsh, bitter laugh that cut me deeper than the freezing wind outside. "Fight it?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Fight an $80 million empire with what money, Harry? Look at you. You are dripping wet and bleeding on a cheap carpet. You do not have the power to fight Sylvia Caldwell. You never did." She uncrossed her arms and walked toward the kitchen counter, putting even more physical distance between us. "I walked into this relationship believing you were the son of Richard Caldwell," she said, her voice turning sharp and venomous. "I spent the last 3 years living in this cramped apartment, budgeting for groceries, eating cheap takeout, and pretending it was all just temporary. I swallowed my pride because you promised me that one day it would all pay off. I thought you were going to inherit your rightful shares of the company. I thought we were going to get out of this miserable neighborhood and finally live the life I deserve." My chest tightened so painfully I could barely breathe. The room started to spin. "I loved you, Chloe," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I thought you loved me. Not the money, not the Caldwell name." She slammed her hand flat against the kitchen counter, her eyes flashing with pure rage. "Do not talk to me about love," she shouted. "Love does not pay off your massive debts. You carry $80,000 in medical bills, Harry. $80,000. You drained your own savings and took out loans to pay for your mother's cancer treatments. Everyone told you she was going to die anyway, but you just had to play the noble hero. You dragged us into a massive financial hole to save a woman who was already terminal." I stood there completely stunned. She had never spoken about my mother like that. During the long months of chemotherapy, Chloe had held my hand and told me I was doing the right thing. She had played the supportive girlfriend perfectly. Now the mask was entirely off. She viewed my sacrifice for my dying mother not as love, not as loyalty, but as a terrible financial investment that ruined her chances at wealth. "I stayed with you because you were supposed to inherit the estate," Chloe continued, her face flushed with anger. "I endured the late-night shifts, the exhaustion, the constant smell of the hospital on your clothes because I knew the Caldwell money was waiting at the finish line. I thought all this struggling was just an investment in a billionaire lifestyle. But now Sylvia has exposed you. You are not a Caldwell. You are not an heir. You are just a broke ambulance driver who cannot even afford to fix the broken heater in his car." With a violent, deliberate motion, Chloe grabbed her left hand and pulled the engagement ring off her finger. It was a modest diamond. I had worked double shifts on the ambulance for 6 solid months to afford it. I had been so incredibly proud to put it on her finger, thinking it symbolized our future. She looked at the ring for a fraction of a second, her lip curling in absolute disdain, and then threw it across the room. The metal hit the kitchen counter with a sharp, pathetic clink and spun off the edge, landing somewhere on the linoleum floor. "I am not spending the rest of my life drowning in your medical debt," she said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. "I am not going to be the laughingstock of this city, married to the bastard son who got kicked to the curb without a single penny. Give me your key." I looked down at the floor where the ring had disappeared, then back up at the woman I thought I was going to marry. My entire world was collapsing piece by piece in a relentless, brutal domino effect. First my father, then my family name, then my dignity, and now the woman I loved. "Chloe, please," I begged one last time, my voice entirely broken. "You are my whole life. If you walk out that door right now, I have absolutely nothing left." She grabbed the handle of her suitcase and pulled it toward the doorway. "That is exactly why I am leaving," she replied. not a single trace of emotion left in her eyes. "Because you are nothing. Now give me the apartment key. The lease is in my name, and I want you out before I call the police and tell them a trespasser is refusing to leave." I reached into my wet pocket with trembling, numb fingers. I pulled out the brass key that unlocked the only home I had left and set it silently on the small table by the door. I had no fight left in me. I was completely empty, hollowed out by the sheer cruelty of the people I had trusted. Chloe grabbed her bags, brushed past me without looking back, and stepped out into the hallway. "You really are a pathetic loser," she said, throwing the final, devastating blow. She slammed the door directly in my face. The loud crack of the wood echoed through the empty apartment like a gunshot. I stood alone in the dead silence, staring at the closed door. I was officially stripped of my family, my money, and the woman I loved. I was carrying $80,000 in debt entirely alone and left with absolutely no place to go in the pouring rain. The rain did not stop. It battered the windshield of my Subaru like gravel as I drove away from the church, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My cheap suit was plastered to my body, heavy and dripping with the cold storm water. But the physical chill creeping into my bones was absolutely nothing compared to the shock freezing my veins. Sylvia had just stripped me of my name in front of the entire city elite. Trent had literally thrown me into the street. My entire history had been erased in a matter of minutes. But as the windshield wipers dragged heavily across the glass, squeaking with every pass, I kept desperately telling myself one thing. I still had Chloe. We had been engaged for a year. We shared a small, cramped apartment on the edge of the city, far away from the Caldwell mansions and their toxic games. I thought we were building a real life together. I thought she loved me for the man I was, the paramedic who worked 70-hour weeks, the man who stayed up all night holding his dying mother's hand. I was foolish enough to believe that when I walked through our front door, she would wrap her arms around me, tell me she believed me, and say we would survive this nightmare together. I parked the car by the curb and ran through the torrential storm, taking the 3 flights of stairs to our apartment 2 at a time. I did not even care that I was tracking dirty rainwater onto the cheap hallway carpet. I just needed to see her face. I pushed my key into the lock, turned it, and shoved the door open. The apartment was dead silent except for the low, mocking sound of the television in the living room. I stepped inside, dripping rain onto the entryway linoleum. And that is when my heart dropped straight into my stomach. 2 large suitcases were sitting right by the front door. On top of them rested her expensive leather tote bag. The closet door down the hall was wide open and half the hangers were entirely empty. I stood there paralyzed, the freezing water dripping from my hair into my eyes. I looked toward the living room. Chloe was standing in the center of the room. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest. She was not crying. She was not worried. She was glaring at me with a level of disgust I had never seen before. Behind her, the television screen was playing a video on a constant loop. I recognized the heavy oak doors of the church. I recognized the stone steps. It was a video of me. 2 massive security guards were dragging me backward by my collar and throwing me onto the wet concrete. The camera shook slightly, and I could hear Trent's voice in the background of the recording, laughing and calling me a garbage truck driving bastard. He had actually had his private security film my brutal humiliation and leaked it directly to their wealthy social circles. And Chloe was watching it. I took a step forward, raising my trembling, bloodied hands. "Chloe," I said, my voice cracking under the weight of the absolute nightmare this day had become. "Please, it is not what it looks like." Sylvia lied. She ambushed me at the altar. She faked a DNA test to cut me out. Chloe did not move an inch. She just stared at my wet, ruined suit and the blood slowly dripping from my scraped palms onto the rug. She reached over to the coffee table and picked up her phone, the screen lighting up with dozens of notifications. "My phone has been exploding for the past hour," she said. Her voice was completely hollow, completely devoid of any warmth or sympathy. "Every single person we know has seen this video. The the wives of the board members, the people I work with at the firm. Everyone is sending me messages asking why my fiancé was thrown out of his own father's funeral like a stray dog. Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is for me? I tried to explain again. I told her that Sylvia orchestrated the whole thing to steal my inheritance to make sure I could not challenge her control of the family trust. I told her we needed to fight it together. We needed to get a lawyer and prove the DNA test was a fraud. I was begging the woman I loved to simply believe me, to stand by my side when I had literally nothing else left in the world. But Chloe let out a harsh, bitter laugh that cut me deeper than the freezing wind outside. Fight it? She asked, raising an eyebrow. Fight an $80 million empire with what money, Harry? Look at you. You are dripping wet and bleeding on a cheap carpet. You do not have the power to fight Sylvia Caldwell. You never did. She uncrossed her arms and walked toward the kitchen counter, putting even more physical distance between us. I walked into this relationship believing you were the son of Richard Caldwell, she said, her voice turning sharp and venomous. I spent the last 3 years living in this cramped apartment, budgeting for groceries, eating cheap takeout, and pretending it was all just temporary. I swallowed my pride because you promised me that one day it would all pay off. I thought you were going to inherit your rightful shares of the company. I thought we were going to get out of this miserable neighborhood and finally live the life I deserve. My chest tightened so painfully I could barely breathe. The room started to spin. I loved you, Chloe, I said, my voice barely a whisper. I thought you loved me. Not the money. Not the Caldwell name. She slammed her hand flat against the kitchen counter, her eyes flashing with pure rage. Do not talk to me about love, she shouted. Love does not pay off your massive debts. You carry $80,000 in medical bills, Harry. $80,000. You drained your own savings and took out loans to pay for your mother's cancer treatments. Everyone told you she was going to die anyway, but you just had to play the noble hero. You dragged us into a massive financial hole to save a woman who was already terminal. I stood there completely stunned. She had never spoken about my mother like that. During the long months of chemotherapy, Chloe had held my hand and told me I was doing the right thing. She had played the supportive girlfriend perfectly. Now the mask was entirely off. She viewed my sacrifice for my dying mother not as love, not as loyalty, but as a terrible financial investment that ruined her chances at wealth. I stayed with you because you were supposed to inherit the estate, Chloe continued, her face flushed with anger. I endured the late-night shifts, the exhaustion, the constant smell of the hospital on your clothes because I knew the Caldwell money was waiting at the finish line. I thought all this struggling was just an investment in a billionaire lifestyle. But now Sylvia has exposed you. You are not a Caldwell. You are not an heir. You are just a broke ambulance driver who cannot even afford to fix the broken heater in his car. With a violent, deliberate motion, Chloe grabbed her left hand and pulled the engagement ring off her finger. It was a modest diamond. I had worked double shifts on the ambulance for 6 solid months to afford it. I had been so incredibly proud to put it on her finger, thinking it symbolized our future. She looked at the ring for a fraction of a second, her lip curling in absolute disdain, and then threw it across the room. The metal hit the kitchen counter with a sharp, pathetic clink and spun off the edge, landing somewhere on the linoleum floor. I am not spending the rest of my life drowning in your medical debt, she said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. I am not going to be the laughingstock of this city, married to the bastard son who got kicked to the curb without a single penny. Give me your key. I looked down at the floor where the ring had disappeared, then back up at the woman I thought I was going to marry. My entire world was collapsing piece by piece in a relentless, brutal domino effect. First my father, then my family name, then my dignity, and now the woman I loved. Chloe, please. I begged one last time, my voice entirely broken. You are my whole life. If you walk out that door right now, I have absolutely nothing left. She grabbed the handle of her suitcase and pulled it toward the doorway. That is exactly why I am leaving. she replied, not a single trace of emotion left in her eyes. Because you are nothing. Now give me the apartment key. The lease is in my name, and I want you out before I call the police and tell them a trespasser is refusing to leave. I reached into my wet pocket with trembling, numb fingers. I pulled out the brass key that unlocked the only home I had left and set it silently on the small table by the door. I had no fight left in me. I was completely empty, hollowed out by the sheer cruelty of the people I had trusted. Chloe grabbed her bags, brushed past me without looking back, and stepped out into the hallway. "You really are a pathetic loser," she said, throwing the final devastating blow. She slammed the door directly in my face. The loud crack of the wood echoed through the empty apartment like a gunshot. I stood alone in the dead silence, staring at the closed door. I was officially stripped of my family, my money, and the woman I loved. I was carrying $80,000 in debt entirely alone and left with absolutely no place to go in the pouring rain. I had no choice but to leave. I walked back down the stairs and out into the storm, climbing into the cold, damp cabin of my Subaru. I pulled into the empty parking lot of the emergency medical services station. The yellow security lights buzzing overhead illuminated the cracked asphalt. I turned off the engine, and the heavy silence of my new reality crashed down on me. I pulled out my phone and opened my banking application. The screen glowed in the dark cabin, showing a total balance of exactly $42. That was my entire net worth. That was the sum total of my 34 years of existence. The temperature outside was dropping rapidly, hovering just above freezing. I curled my tall frame into the driver's seat, pulling my damp, ruined suit jacket tight around my chest. I tried to close my eyes, but every time I did, I saw Sylvia's vicious smile. I saw Trent signaling those massive security guards. My own family had erased me, and the woman I loved had looked at my empty bank account and decided I was worthless. I shivered violently. The cold seeped through the cheap fabric of my clothes, settling deep into my bones. I stared at the digital clock on the dashboard. It was 2 a.m. My shift did not start for another 4 hours, but sleep was impossible. I lay there in the freezing dark, listening to the rain, wondering how a life could be dismantled so completely in a single day. Sylvia and Trent were probably asleep in their heated, custom-built mansions, right now resting their heads on imported silk pillowcases, dreaming about how to spend my father's $80 million empire. They had stolen my identity without breaking a single sweat, and I was freezing in a rusted car, praying I had enough gas to make it through the week. At 5:30 in the morning, I finally gave up on resting. I dragged my stiff, aching body out of the car and walked into the station locker room. The harsh fluorescent lights hummed above me. I peeled off the damp, wrinkled suit and threw it into the bottom of my locker. I pulled on my dark blue uniform pants, my heavy work boots, and my high-visibility jacket. As I zipped up the jacket, I looked at my reflection in the smudged mirror. I looked 10 years older than I had yesterday morning. My eyes were bloodshot and dark circles bruised the skin beneath them. But putting on that uniform changed something inside me. It reminded me that I had a purpose that Sylvia could never touch. My partner for the day, a veteran medic named Dave, tossed me a cup of black coffee as I walked into the break room. He took one look at my face and did not ask any questions. In our line of work, you learn to recognize when a man is carrying the weight of the world. You just hand him caffeine and wait for the tones to drop. We did not have to wait long. At exactly 6:15, the station alarm blared. The dispatch radio crackled to life, reporting a severe multi-vehicle collision on the interstate bypass. A suspected drunk driver had crossed the median. We rushed to the rig. I jumped into the driver's seat, hit the lights and sirens, and slammed my foot on the gas. The heavy ambulance roared out of the bay, cutting through the early morning fog. The adrenaline hit my bloodstream, instantly burning away the exhaustion and the cold. This was my world. This was the reality that Trent and Sylvia knew absolutely nothing about. They spent their days in climate-controlled boardrooms, arguing over profit margins and stock portfolios. They destroyed lives with pens and paper. Out here on the wet pavement, Life and death were not abstract concepts negotiated by lawyers. They were brutal, immediate, and covered in blood. We arrived at the scene 10 minutes later. The interstate was a chaotic nightmare of twisted metal, shattered glass, and flashing police lights. A large pickup truck had completely crushed the front end of a small silver sedan. The driver of the truck was already out stumbling around and reeking of alcohol, but my eyes immediately locked onto the sedan. The driver's side door was caved in, pinning the driver inside. I grabbed my trauma bag and sprinted across the slick asphalt. When I reached the window, I saw a teenager no older than 17 slumped over the steering wheel. He was entirely unresponsive. His face was covered in deep lacerations from the shattered windshield, and a massive amount of blood was soaking the front of his shirt. "Stay with me, buddy," I shouted, reaching through the broken glass to check his pulse. It was faint and incredibly rapid. He was losing too much blood, and his airway was compromised. The steering column was crushing his chest. Fire rescue arrived with the hydraulic tools, and I stayed right beside the boy as they tore the heavy metal door off its hinges. The noise was deafening, a horrible screech of tearing steel, but I completely tuned it out. My entire focus was on keeping this kid breathing. When they finally pried the dashboard up, Dave and I carefully slid the backboard beneath him and pulled him out of the wreckage. We loaded him into the back of the ambulance, and Dave hit the gas toward the trauma center. The back of the rig became a desperate, chaotic fight for survival. I was on my knees on the metal floor, applying direct pressure to a severe arterial bleed on the boy's leg. My hands were soaked in his warm blood. It soaked through my gloves and stained the sleeves of my uniform. I shouted instructions to the hospital over the radio while simultaneously securing a tourniquet and pushing intravenous fluids into his arm. As the siren wailed above us, I looked down at the boy's pale face. He was fighting so hard just to take his next breath. And in that desperate, blood-soaked moment, a crystal-clear realization hit me. This is what real value looks like. This is what it means to actually hold someone's life in your hands. Trent walked around in his $5,000 Tom Ford suits, acting like he was a god, because he sat in a leather chair and ordered people around. Sylvia draped herself in pearls and judged the world from the balcony of her penthouse. They thought wealth made them superior. They thought their bank accounts made them invincible. But put Trent in the back of this ambulance, cover his expensive shoes in a stranger's blood, and ask him to save a life. He would freeze. He would break. He was a weak, hollow coward hiding behind my father's money. I pressed harder on the boy's wound, willing my own strength into him. I was not a bastard. I was not a parasite. I was a man who stood between death and the people who needed help. My father had known that. He had seen the superficial rot inside Sylvia and Trent. He knew I chose a life of difficult, unglamorous service over the toxic luxury they worshipped. And suddenly the public humiliation at the church felt incredibly small. They had stolen paper and concrete. I still had my soul. We rolled into the emergency room bay, shouting vitals and transferring the boy to the trauma surgical team. The doctors rushed him into the operating room. A nurse pulled me aside 30 minutes later and told me the tourniquet had saved his leg and the rapid fluid intervention had saved his life. He was going to make it. I walked back out to the ambulance bay and leaned against the cold metal side of the rig. The rain had finally stopped, leaving a gray, overcast sky. I was completely physically drained. My muscles ached with a deep, punishing fire. My uniform jacket was heavily stained with dried blood and sweat. I smelled like metallic copper and damp wool. I looked down at my hands, still shaking slightly from the adrenaline crash. I had saved a life, but I was still entirely broken in my own. I still had no home. I still had $42 to my name. Right then, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out and stared at the screen. The caller identification showed the name Sterling. It was my father's estate attorney, the man who had stood silently by the altar while Sylvia declared me a fraud. I swiped the screen and brought the phone to my ear. "Hello," I said, my voice hoarse and raw. "Harrison," Mr. Sterling said. His tone was perfectly flat, icy, and entirely professional. He spoke to me as if I were a stranger calling a customer service line. I am contacting you to officially inform you that the reading of your late father's last will and testament will take place tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock sharp in my downtown office. I closed my eyes and leaned my head back against the wet ambulance. Mr. Sterling, I replied, keeping my voice steady. Sylvia made it very clear yesterday that I am not considered part of the family. She claimed she had DNA proof. I am sure she has already instructed you to remove me from the building if I show up. Why are you calling me? I am calling you because I am legally obligated to do so, Sterling answered coldly. Your father's documents name you as an attending party. Regardless of your stepmother's claims at the funeral service, the legal execution of the document requires your physical presence in the room. Failure to appear will constitute a voluntary forfeiture of any potential allocated assets. Do you understand? I understood perfectly. This was a trap. Sylvia and Trent were going to use the formal legal setting of the law firm to permanently lock me out. They wanted me in that room so they could waive the fabricated DNA test in front of the attorneys, legally finalize my expulsion from the $80 million estate, and force me to sign away any right to appeal. They wanted to watch me break one last time in a room where I had no power. Every instinct I had screamed at me to hang up the phone. I wanted to tell Sterling to burn the will. I wanted to walk away from the Caldwell name forever and never look back at the toxic empire that had destroyed my mother and ruined my life. I did not want to sit in a room with the people who had treated me like absolute garbage. But then I remembered the number on my banking application. $42. I remembered the heavy, crushing weight of the $80,000 medical debt that was waiting to bury me. I remembered that my rented apartment was gone, the key surrendered to a woman who despised me for being poor. I had nowhere to sleep tonight but the front seat of a rusted Subaru with a broken heater. I hated them. I hated everything they stood for. But if there was even a fraction of a % chance that my father had left me a few $1,000s, a single small account, or even just enough cash to cover a security deposit on a new apartment, I had to take it. I was in a pure survival crisis. My pride had already been executed in front of 300 people. I could not afford to let pride keep me starving on the streets. I will be there, I said, my voice low and hard. 9 o'clock sharp. Harrison Sterling repeated. Do not be late. The receptionist will validate your parking. The line went dead. The dial tone hummed in my ear, a hollow mechanical sound that perfectly matched the emptiness in my gut. I lowered the phone and shoved it back into my pocket. I looked down at my blood-stained uniform. Tomorrow morning I would have to walk into a multi-million-dollar corporate law firm. I would have to sit across a mahogany table from the woman who called my mother a lying opportunist and the brother who laughed while his security guards dragged me through the mud. I was walking directly into the shark's den. I knew they were going to offer me nothing but further humiliation. I knew they were preparing to throw me a few pennies just to watch me crawl. But as I stared out at the gray city skyline, feeling the cold morning air bite into my skin, I made a silent vow. I was going to walk into that room. I was going to look Sylvia Caldwell directly in her eyes. I was going to let them say whatever they wanted to say. Because I was a man who survived the night shift. I was a man who fought death with his bare hands. And I was not going to let a pair of wealthy cowards intimidate me into completely vanishing from the world. The elevator ride to the 40th floor of the Sterling & Vance law firm took exactly 45 seconds. I counted every single floor as the digital numbers ticked upward. My ears popped from the altitude change, but it was the heavy, suffocating dread in my chest that made it hard to breathe. I stepped out into a lobby that smelled of lemon polish and wealth. The floors were cut from imported Italian marble. My heavy work boots squeaked against the polished stone, leaving faint, dusty footprints behind. I was still wearing the exact same dark blue paramedic uniform from my night shift. The fabric was deeply wrinkled, smelling faintly of metallic copper from the blood of the teenager I had pulled from the car wreck just hours ago. I had not slept in 2 days. I had $42 to my name, and I was walking directly into a slaughterhouse. The secretary led me to a massive set of double doors at the end of a long hallway. She pulled them open, and the cold, heavily air-conditioned air of the boardroom hit my face. It was a cavernous room built entirely from rich, dark mahogany. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic, godlike view of the city skyline, but I did not look at the view. My eyes immediately locked onto the two people sitting at the far end of the massive conference table. Sylvia and Trent were already there. They did not look like a grieving widow and a mourning son. They looked like two billionaires waiting to board a private jet for a tropical vacation. Sylvia was wearing a crisp white designer pantsuit that probably cost 3 months of my salary. A massive diamond necklace rested against her collarbone. She was leaning back in her plush leather chair, swirling a glass of sparkling water, a bright, relaxed smile on her face. Trent was sitting next to her, slouched casually with his ankle resting on his knee. His custom charcoal suit jacket was draped over the back of his chair, revealing a silk shirt and a solid gold Rolex watch that caught the sunlight pouring through the windows. He was scrolling through his phone, laughing quietly at something on the screen. They looked up when I walked in. The smiles vanished instantly, replaced by identical expressions of absolute disgust. I took a seat at the complete opposite end of the 20-foot table. I did not say a word. I pulled out my chair and sat down, keeping my posture straight despite the agonizing ache in my lower back. I placed my calloused, stained hands on the polished wood. The silence stretched between us thick and toxic. Trent scoffed loudly, dropping his phone onto the table with a clatter. "Are you completely incapable of showing respect?" Trent asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "You walk into a corporate law firm smelling like a public hospital waiting room. You look like a vagrant. I am genuinely surprised security even let you pass the lobby." I stared at him, refusing to take the bait. I remembered the boy in the ambulance. I remembered holding a human artery closed with my bare hands. I looked at Trent's manicured fingernails and his soft, untested hands. He had never worked a hard day in his entire life. He had never faced a single consequence. "I came straight from a shift, Trent," I said evenly. "Some of us actually have to work for a living. Some of us do not spend our days waiting for other people to die so we can collect a check." Sylvia slammed her glass of sparkling water down on the table. The ice cubes clattered sharply. "Do not speak to my son that way." She snapped, her eyes narrowing into cold slits. "You are only here because the legal protocol requires it. You are a formality, Harrison. Nothing more. So keep your mouth shut and sit quietly until Mr. Sterling dismisses you." I clamped my jaw shut. I needed the money. I needed just enough to rent a room to get my car heater fixed to buy a week's worth of groceries. My survival depended on whatever scraps my father might have managed to leave behind before Sylvia manipulated his entire estate. I thought about the $80,000 in medical debt resting entirely on my shoulders. I swallowed my pride and stared straight ahead. The side door opened and Attorney Sterling walked in. He was a tall, incredibly rigid man in his late 60s, carrying a thick leather briefcase. He did not offer any condolences. He did not ask how anyone was doing. He walked directly to the head of the table, sat down, and opened his briefcase. His face was a mask of pure legal detachment. "Let us begin," Sterling said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "We are here to execute the final will and testament of Richard Thomas Caldwell. The estate has been thoroughly evaluated. The total liquid and physical assets are valued at approximately $82 million. Hearing the number spoken out loud made the air leave the room. $82 million. It was a sum of money that defied comprehension. It was enough money to build hospitals. It was enough money to change thousands of lives. And it was all about to be handed to the two most toxic, narcissistic people I had ever known. Sterling put on his reading glasses and picked up the first stack of heavy parchment paper. He cleared his throat and began to read the distribution of the empire. "To my wife, Sylvia Caldwell." Sterling read, his voice monotone and steady. "I leave the primary residential estate in the Hamptons, the penthouse in Manhattan, and the property in Aspen. Furthermore, I leave the 70-foot yacht currently docked in Miami alongside 60% of all voting shares in Caldwell Commercial Real Estate Development." Sylvia closed her eyes and let out a long, satisfied sigh. A massive, victorious smile spread across her face. She reached out and patted Trent's arm. It was the smile of a predator who had just swallowed her prey whole. She had secured the majority control. She was officially the absolute ruler of the Caldwell Empire. Sterling did not pause. He turned the page. To my son, Trent Caldwell, I leave 40% of all voting shares in the company, along with the immediate and permanent title of Chief Executive Officer. Furthermore, I leave the private investment portfolios and the offshore holding accounts to be managed at his sole discretion. Trent let out a loud, triumphant cheer. He actually slammed his fist down on the table in celebration. He leaned back in his chair, lacing his fingers together behind his head, looking around the room as if he had just won a gold medal. He looked directly at me, his eyes shining with pure arrogance. Did you hear that Harry Trent asked a cruel, mocking laugh bubbling up from his throat? CEO. Permanent. CEO. I control the board. I control the development deals. I control the entire city skyline. And you control the sirens on a rented ambulance. It is actually poetic when you think about it. I kept my hands flat on the table. My knuckles were stark white. The sheer injustice of it was a physical weight pressing down on my chest. My father had built that company with his own bare hands. He had started with a single broken-down apartment building and worked 18-hour days for decades. He had taught me the value of hard work, of integrity, of earning every single dollar you made. And now he had handed his life's work over to a spoiled, arrogant child who cared about absolutely nothing but himself. Sterling adjusted his glasses. He looked up from the papers, his cold eyes landing on me. There is one final distribution, Sterling said. Sylvia rolled her eyes and let out an exaggerated theatrical sigh. Oh, for heaven's sake, Sterling, she sneered, waving her hand dismissively in the air. Richard was far too sentimental. Just give him $100 for subway fare and let him get back to his miserable little life. The air in this room is getting incredibly stale. Sterling ignored her. He pulled a single thin sheet of paper from the very bottom of his leather folder. It looked remarkably different from the thick legal parchment of the rest of the will. It looked old. To my son, Harrison Caldwell Sterling read. Trent laughed out loud. The bastard gets a mention, he interrupted. Let us hear it, Sterling. What did the old man leave his favorite charity case? A broken watch, a pat on the back. Sterling continued, his voice completely flat. To my son, Harrison Caldwell, I leave the following single asset. The 1978 Ford F-150 pickup truck vehicle identification number ending in 482, currently located at the Miller Scrapyard on the south side of the city. This vehicle is transferred as is with all faults and constitutes the entirety of Harrison Caldwell's inheritance. The boardroom went completely instantly silent for a fraction of a second. I sat frozen in my chair. My heart stopped beating. I stared at Sterling, waiting for him to turn the page, waiting for him to read the rest of the sentence. I waited to hear about a small trust fund to pay off my mother's medical debt. I waited to hear about a modest cash sum that would keep me from sleeping in my car tonight. I waited for the lifeline my father surely must have left me, but Sterling simply closed the folder. That concludes the physical asset distribution, he said. A rusted, broken-down 1978 pickup truck. A piece of literal junk rotting in a scrapyard on the worst side of town. That was my entire inheritance from an $80 million estate. Trent erupted. He threw his head back and howled with laughter. The sound bounced off the mahogany walls, loud, piercing, and incredibly cruel. He laughed so hard he had to wipe tears from the corners of his eyes. He slammed his hand against the table over and over again. A junkyard truck, Trent wheezed, struggling to catch his breath. A rusted-out piece of absolute garbage. Oh my God, this is the greatest day of my entire life. I thought he was going to leave you a few $1,000s just to be annoying, but he left you a literal pile of scrap metal. You are a millionaire in rust, Harry. You can drive your garbage truck right back to your garbage apartment. Sylvia was smiling so widely it looked like her face might crack. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the polished wood, looking at me with pure, unadulterated triumph. "You see, Harrison?" Sylvia said, her voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. "Richard finally saw you for exactly what you are. Worthless. He knew you were not a real Caldwell. He knew you did not belong in our world. He gave you the only thing you are actually equipped to handle. Trash. I told you yesterday at the church that you were going to get nothing, and I was right. You are a parasite, and now you have been permanently cut off." My vision blurred. A loud rushing sound filled my ears. The crushing realization of the insult hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. It was not just the lack of money. It was the deliberate, calculated cruelty of the gift. My father had specifically chosen a broken, discarded vehicle sitting in a scrapyard. He had specifically chosen to give Trent an empire and give me a piece of garbage. I sat there in my wrinkled paramedic uniform, completely paralyzed by the devastation. I had $42 in the bank. I was $80,000 in debt. I was homeless, exhausted, and utterly alone. I had fought to save lives while these two monsters plotted to ruin mine, and somehow they had won. They had the mansions, the yachts, and the millions. They had all the power, and they were openly celebrating my total destruction right in front of my face. I looked down at my hands. They were still stained with the faint, rusty color of the teenager's blood from the highway. My hands were meant for saving. Their hands were meant for stealing. But in this mahogany room on the 40th floor above the city, my hands were entirely powerless. Sylvia pushed her heavy leather chair back from the mahogany table. The legs of the chair scraped loudly against the polished hardwood floor, a harsh sound that signaled her absolute victory. She stood up, smoothing the invisible wrinkles from her crisp white designer pantsuit. She reached for her diamond-studded clutch, snapping it shut with a sharp, finalized click. "Well, Sterling," she said, her voice echoing in the cavernous boardroom, "I believe we are entirely finished here. You have your instructions. Begin the immediate transfer of the commercial deeds into my name. Trent needs his new executive office cleared out and prepped by Monday morning." She turned her gaze toward me. The look she gave me was worse than hatred. It was absolute pity mixed with total disgust. "You can leave now, Harrison," Sylvia told me, lifting her chin. "The receptionist will validate your parking on the way out. Do not attempt to contact us again. Do not show up at the corporate headquarters. If you try to claim even a single tire from that junkyard truck, I will make sure the legal fees bury you for the rest of your miserable life. You are nothing to this family." Trent stood up right beside her. He grabbed his custom charcoal suit jacket and slung it casually over his shoulder. He checked his solid gold Rolex watch, a gift my father had given him for his college graduation, a graduation he barely passed. "Let us go, Mother," Trent said, flashing his perfect, expensive smile. "I made reservations at the steakhouse. We have an $80 million empire to run, and frankly, breathing the same air as this paramedic is giving me a headache. Enjoy your garbage truck, Harry. I hear scrap metal is selling for a whole 10 cents a pound these days." They turned their backs to me. They were already walking toward the massive double doors of the boardroom. My heart was pounding a frantic, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I felt completely paralyzed. They had taken my father, my name, my inheritance, and my dignity. They were walking out the door with the entire world in their hands, leaving me with a rusted truck and $80,000 in medical debt. "Sit down." The voice cracked through the room like a physical whip. It was not my voice. It was Attorney Sterling. Sylvia paused, her hand hovering just inches from the brass door handle. She turned around slowly, a look of extreme annoyance crossing her face. "Excuse me, Sterling?" she asked, her tone dripping with toxic arrogance. "We are done here. The assets have been distributed." Sterling did not look at her. He kept his eyes locked on the thick leather folder resting on the table in front of him. He reached out and picked up a solid wooden gavel that sat on the corner of his desk. He brought it down against the mahogany wood with one single deafening strike. "I said sit down, Sylvia." Sterling raised his head, his cold professional eyes narrowing. "We are not finished. I have not formally closed this session. Return to your seats immediately, or I will legally rule that you have abandoned the reading, which will automatically delay your asset transfers by a minimum of 6 months. The threat of delayed money worked instantly. Sylvia's jaw tightened in pure fury. She glared at Sterling, but she marched back to her chair and sat down stiffly. Trent followed her, rolling his eyes and throwing his jacket back over his seat. "Make it quick," Trent snapped, leaning back and crossing his arms. "I do not know what else there is to say. You read the will. I am the chief executive officer. My mother controls the majority shares. The bastard gets a junkyard truck. We are done." Sterling ignored Trent completely. He turned the final page of the thick legal document. Beneath it was a sealed manila envelope. The envelope had a thick red wax seal stamped with my father's personal signet ring. Sterling picked up a silver letter opener and sliced through the top of the envelope. "What I just read to you was the primary distribution of the estate." Sterling explained, his voice entirely flat and devoid of any emotion. However, Richard Thomas Caldwell amended his last will and testament exactly 3 weeks before his passing. He added an absolute non-negotiable contingency. He named it the DNA clause. Sylvia let out a loud, mocking laugh. "A DNA clause," she repeated, shaking her head. Richard was always so incredibly paranoid. "Well, that works out perfectly for us, does it not? I already proved Harrison is a fraud. I stood in front of 300 people at the church yesterday and presented the laboratory report. I already enacted the DNA clause. Harrison is out." Sterling pulled a crisp white document from the envelope. He laid it flat on the table and folded his hands over it. "You did not enact the clause, Sylvia." "You triggered it," Sterling said. His words were precise and sharp, cutting through her arrogance. "Richard anticipated that you would attempt to discredit Harrison's paternity. He knew exactly what you were planning, and he left specific legal instructions on how to handle it." Sterling picked up the document and began to read. "I, Richard Thomas Caldwell, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this final stipulation to my last will and testament. I have spent my life building an empire of immense value. I know the greed that money breeds. Therefore, should my wife Sylvia Caldwell or my son Trent Caldwell submit any legal, public, or verbal challenge regarding the biological paternity of my son Harrison Caldwell, a total and immediate asset freeze shall be placed on my entire estate." The boardroom went incredibly still. The only sound was the low hum of the air conditioning unit above us. I stared at Sterling, my heart creeping up into my throat. "Wait," Trent said, leaning forward, his confident smirk suddenly faltering. "What do you mean an asset freeze? You just said, 'I am the CEO.' You just gave us the shares." "I read the primary allocation," Trent Sterling corrected him firmly. "But the contingency clause overrides the primary allocation. Because your mother publicly challenged Harrison's paternity at the funeral yesterday, the $80 million estate is now completely locked. Neither you nor your mother have access to the bank accounts, the properties, the yacht, or the commercial real estate voting shares. You are not the CEO, Trent. You are nothing until this clause is satisfied." Sylvia stood up, her face flushing with bright red anger. "This is an absolute outrage," she screamed, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at Sterling. "You are a terrible lawyer. I proved he is not Richard's son. I have the medical document. I showed it to the entire city. The estate belongs to us. You cannot freeze my money because I told the truth." Sterling did not flinch. He looked at Sylvia with a chilling absolute calm. "Richard did not trust your documents," Sylvia Sterling replied quietly. "He stated here that any document provided by you regarding paternity is to be considered legally fraudulent by this firm. He put a single condition in place to unfreeze the assets." "What condition?" Trent demanded, his voice rising in panic. "Tell us the condition so we can get this over with and get my money." Sterling looked down at the paper again. "The condition to unfreeze the $80 million estate requires every named heir in this room to undergo a court-mandated independent DNA test. This test will be administered by a federal medical examiner appointed by this law firm. No outside documents will be accepted. No private clinics will be used. Every single one of you, Sylvia, Trent, and Harrison, will submit blood and tissue samples to the federal examiner. Sylvia's breath hitched. She took a tiny, almost invisible step backward. Her hands dropped to her sides. "That is ridiculous." Sylvia stammered, her voice suddenly losing all of its commanding power. "I will not be subjected to a federal investigation. Trent is his biological son. I am his wife. We do not need to take a test. Only Harrison needs to be tested to prove he is a fake. The clause mandates that every heir must be tested." Sterling repeated, his voice echoing loudly in the tense room. "If you refuse the test, the entire $80 million estate will be automatically liquidated and donated to a list of charities Richard selected. You will receive absolutely nothing." Trent scoffed, running a hand through his blonde hair. "Fine," he said, trying to force his arrogant smile back onto his face. "Fine. We will take the stupid test. I will spit in a cup right now. I am Richard Caldwell's son. I look exactly like him. I act like him. This is just a waste of my valuable time. Let us take the test and get my company back." Trent looked at his mother, expecting her to agree, expecting her to confidently back him up. But Sylvia did not say a word. I looked across the 20-foot mahogany table. The transformation happening to my stepmother was absolutely terrifying and beautiful all at once. The bright, confident flush in her cheeks had completely vanished. Her skin was turning a sickly, ghostly shade of pale gray. Her eyes were darting rapidly back and forth across the polished wood, searching for an exit that did not exist. Her perfectly steady hands were now trembling so violently that her diamond ring was clicking softly against the table. Mother Trent asked, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Tell him we will take the test. Tell him to set it up." Sylvia opened her mouth, but she could not speak. She looked like she was suffocating. Sterling let the silence hang in the air for a long, heavy moment. He watched Sylvia panic, and then he reached into the envelope one last time. He pulled out a small black audio recorder. "Richard knew you would hesitate, Sylvia," Sterling said quietly. "He knew you would try to find a way out of the test. So he left a final sworn medical affidavit, and he recorded his own voice reading it so there could be no misunderstandings." Sterling pressed the play button on the small black device and set it in the exact center of the long mahogany table. A short hiss of static filled the room. Then my father's voice spoke. The sound of his voice hit me like a physical punch to the chest. It was deep, commanding, and tired. It was the voice of the man who had raised me, the man who had been stolen from me by the two people sitting across the table. I closed my eyes and listened. "Sylvia," my father's recorded voice echoed through the boardroom. "If you are hearing this, it means you could not control your endless greed. It means you tried to destroy Harrison. You spent 20 years whispering lies into my ear. You spent 20 years trying to convince me that my first wife betrayed me, that Harrison was not my real blood. You thought I was a fool. You thought I was blinded by my business." The recording paused for a heavy, ragged breath. Trent looked at the black device, his eyes widening in sudden, creeping terror. "But I am not a fool." My father's voice continued, growing harder and sharper with every single word. "I hired private investigators. I hired forensic accountants. I have known your secrets for a very long time. You claimed Harrison was a bastard. You demanded that Trent take over my legacy because he was my true biological heir. But we both know that is a complete biological impossibility." Sylvia let out a small, broken gasp. She grabbed the edge of the table, her knuckles turning bone white as she tried to keep herself standing. "I mandate this federal DNA test," my father's voice stated, ringing with absolute, undeniable authority. "Because 5 years before Trent was even born, I suffered a severe medical complication. The surgery was highly classified. Only my private doctors knew. Due to that complication, I underwent a permanent, irreversible vasectomy. The boardroom shattered into absolute dead silence. The air was completely sucked out of the room. I stopped breathing. Trent stopped breathing. The only sound was the faint hum of the city traffic 40 floors below us. I have been permanently sterile since I was 35 years old. My father's recording declared delivering the fatal, crushing blow. Therefore, it is a medical certainty that Trent is not my son. He is the product of an affair. He carries no Caldwell blood. Harrison is my first, my only, and my true biological child. I leave this DNA clause to trap you in your own toxic web of lies. Checkmate, Sylvia. The recording clicked off. The silence that followed was heavier than anything I had ever experienced in my entire life. It was a dense, suffocating weight that pressed down on every single person in the room. I stared across the table. The reality of the words was settling over us like falling ash. Sylvia had built her entire existence on a lie. She had spent 2 decades treating me like garbage, calling my mother a cheat, and elevating Trent as the golden heir. And all along, she was the cheat. She was the liar. She had brought another man's child into my father's house and demanded he be treated like a king. The blood had completely drained from Sylvia's face. She looked 20 years older. Her expensive white designer suit suddenly looked absurd on her trembling, broken frame. She stared blankly at the black audio recorder on the table, her mouth hanging slightly open in pure, unadulterated shock. Her grand master plan, her $80 million theft, had just been completely incinerated by a medical fact she never knew existed. Trent looked like he had been struck by lightning. He was staring at his mother with wide, horrified eyes. His arrogant, lazy posture was completely gone. He gripped the arms of his chair, his chest heaving up and down. Mother Trent stammered. His voice was incredibly high and thin, sounding like a terrified child instead of a corporate executive. Mother, what is he talking about? Tell him it is a lie. Tell Sterling it is a lie. Sylvia did not look at him. She could not look at him. She just stared at the table, her chest trembling as she tried to pull air into her panicked lungs. Tell him, Trent screamed, slamming his hands down on the mahogany table. The sudden noise made Sylvia flinch violently. You told me I was the heir. You told me I was his son. Tell them he is lying. Sylvia slowly raised her hands and covered her face. She let out a wretched, pathetic sob that sounded nothing like the fake tears she cried at the funeral. This was the sound of a woman whose entire fraudulent life had just been violently ripped away from her. Trent stared at her weeping form, the horrifying truth finally breaking through his thick skull. He looked down at his custom Tom Ford suit. He looked at his solid gold Rolex watch. He looked around the $80 million boardroom that he had just claimed as his own. And then he looked across the long table directly at me. I sat perfectly still in my wrinkled, blood-stained paramedic uniform. The exhaustion and the freezing cold from the morning storm had completely vanished. I looked at Trent, the golden boy who had ordered security to drag me through the mud. I looked at the man who had laughed at my rusted garbage truck just 10 minutes ago. He was the bastard. He was the parasite. He was the one with no right to the Caldwell name. I am the sole biological heir. The game had instantly reversed. The $80 million empire was locked, and the key was my blood. Sylvia and Trent were trapped in a room with the truth, and there was absolutely nowhere left for them to run. Their wealthy, arrogant world was crumbling into dust right before my eyes. And as I watched Trent's face twist into absolute panic, I knew my father had given me the greatest gift I could ever ask for. He gave me justice. The checkmate was absolute, and the board had just been violently flipped. I walked out of that mahogany boardroom on the 40th floor thinking the war was finally over. I thought my father had delivered the ultimate unbreakable checkmate from beyond the grave. I actually believed that the American legal system was a clean and straightforward machine that would simply force Sylvia and Trent to submit their blood to the medical examiner, expose their massive fraud, and hand me back my rightful legacy. I was incredibly naive. I was a working-class paramedic who spent his life pulling broken bodies out of shattered cars. I did not understand that for the ultra-wealthy elite, the law is not a set of rules meant to deliver justice. The law is simply a highly expensive weapon you buy to completely crush the people who cannot afford to defend themselves. Sylvia did not surrender. She did not panic and submit to the court-mandated DNA test. Instead, she left Attorney Sterling's office, went straight to the financial district, and used the millions of dollars she had already hoarded in her private accounts to purchase the most ruthless, aggressive team of corporate litigators in the entire state. She hired a firm comprised entirely of legal sharks men who specialized in destroying lives and burying the truth under mountains of suffocating paperwork. Less than 48 hours after the boardroom meeting, the counterattack began. I was sitting in the dispatch room of the emergency medical station, exhausted after another brutal night shift, when a man in a sharp gray suit walked through the double doors. He did not look like a patient. He walked straight up to me, asked to confirm my name, and dropped a massive heavy stack of legal documents right onto my lap. "You have been served," he said coldly, turning around and walking out before I could even process what was happening. My partner Dave watched in stunned silence as I picked up the thick stack of papers. The bold legal print on the front page made the blood completely drain from my face. Sylvia had not just ignored the DNA clause. She had filed a massive emergency injunction in probate court to completely invalidate my father's last will and testament. I read through the documents, my hands shaking with a mixture of pure rage and absolute terror. Sylvia's new lawyers had crafted a brilliant evil narrative. They formally claimed that my father, Richard Caldwell, had been suffering from severe, undiagnosed dementia during the last 2 years of his life. They included a fabricated psychological evaluation signed by a highly paid private doctor who had never even met my father, stating that his mental capacity was entirely compromised. But the lies did not stop there. The legal filing went on to explicitly accuse Attorney Sterling of elder abuse and criminal conspiracy. Sylvia claimed that Sterling and I had worked together in the dark to forge the DNA clause, manipulating a dying, confused old man into signing a document he did not understand. They argued that the audio recording was an artificial fabrication, a desperate attempt by a broke paramedic to steal an $80 million empire from the rightful grieving widow and her legitimate son. Because of the sheer size of the estate and the aggressive nature of the filing, the probate judge granted Sylvia's emergency injunction. The DNA test was officially blocked indefinitely. The court ordered that all inheritance proceedings be halted until a full, multi-year investigation could be conducted into my father's mental state. They had successfully bought themselves time. But buying time was only the first part of Sylvia's brilliant and incredibly destructive plan. With the will contested and the assets suspended in legal limbo, Sylvia utilized a loophole in the corporate bylaws. Because she was technically still the acting executor on paper prior to my father's death, her lawyers petitioned the judge to grant her temporary receivership of the commercial real estate company. They argued that an $80 million corporation could not survive a multi-year legal freeze without active executive leadership. They claimed the employees would lose their jobs and the current real estate developments would collapse. The judge, swayed by the high-priced lawyers and the promise of economic stability, granted her the temporary executive powers. That was when the real bleeding began. I found out 3 days later through a sympathetic clerk who used to work closely with my father. He called my cheap prepaid cell phone late at night, his voice hushed and terrified. He told me that Trent had moved into the massive corner office on the top floor. He told me that Sylvia and Trent were not managing the company. They were systematically looting it. Using their temporary executive powers, they were approving massive, unjustifiable cash transfers out of the corporate accounts. They were liquidating physical properties at a fraction of their value, selling off massive commercial lots to anonymous shell companies that they secretly controlled overseas. They were taking the entire $80 million empire and turning it into untraceable offshore cash. They knew the truth was eventually going to come out. They knew that if a judge ever forced them to take that DNA test, they would lose everything. So they were scorching the earth. They were making absolutely sure that by the time I finally won the legal battle and proved my bloodline, there would be absolutely nothing left for me to inherit. I would inherit a bankrupt, hollowed-out shell of a company drowning in debt. They were stealing my father's legacy right out from under the nose of the legal system, and they were planning to flee the country with the cash the second the walls closed in. I was completely desperate. I tried to report them. I spent my one day off marching into the local police precinct and the district attorney's office. I begged the detectives to look at the financial transfers. I told them my stepmother and my half-brother were embezzling millions of dollars while hiding behind a fake legal injunction. But I was just a visibly exhausted ambulance driver in a cheap jacket. The detectives took one look at the names on the file, saw the incredibly powerful corporate law firm representing Sylvia, and told me it was a civil matter. They told me I needed to hire my own lawyer and take it up in probate court. The system was entirely designed to protect the people who could afford to manipulate it. When Sylvia found out I had gone to the authorities, she decided to drop the final crushing hammer on my life. It happened at the end of a grueling 14-hour shift. I was walking out of the hospital emergency room completely covered in sweat, just wanting to go sleep in the freezing cabin of my car. Another man in a sharp suit was waiting for me by the sliding glass doors. He handed me a second, even thicker stack of legal papers. I opened the file standing there on the concrete sidewalk. The words blurred together, but the terrifying reality of the document was impossible to miss. Sylvia and Trent were not just blocking the inheritance anymore. They were personally suing me. They had filed a civil lawsuit against me for $20 million. The charges were defamation, intentional infliction of severe emotional distress, and tortious interference with a corporate entity. They claimed my visit to the police department was a malicious, calculated attempt to destroy their public reputation and sabotage the stock value of the family company. I stood there in the cold wind staring at a lawsuit demanding $20 million from a man who currently had exactly $38 to his name. The absurdity of it would have been funny if it was not so absolutely terrifying. They did not actually expect me to pay them $20 million. They knew I was completely broke. The lawsuit was a siege tactic. It was designed to legally bury me alive. They were forcing me to defend myself in a high court, knowing I could not afford to fight back. If I ignored the lawsuit, they would win a default judgment, garnish my meager paramedic wages for the rest of my natural life, and legally push me into total unrecoverable bankruptcy. I needed help. I needed a lawyer. I spent the next 4 days burning through every single hour of my free time driving across the city, walking into dozens of legal offices. I carried the last will and testament, the audio recording, and the injunction papers in a battered plastic folder. I sat in waiting rooms, begging for just 15 minutes of anyone's time. Every single meeting ended exactly the same way. The lawyers would listen to my story with polite sympathy. They would look at the DNA clause and nod their heads, but the absolute second they saw the name of the law firm representing Sylvia, the sympathy vanished from their eyes. They would slide the papers back across the desk and shake their heads. "I am sorry, Mr. Caldwell," one senior partner told me, his voice heavy with grim reality. "You have a compelling narrative. But Sylvia Caldwell has retained a legal team that charges $2,000 an hour per attorney. They have unlimited resources to drag this out for a decade. They will file motion after motion burying you in discovery requests and procedural delays until you are utterly exhausted. To even begin to fight this injunction and defend you against the defamation suit, I would require a minimum retainer fee of $100,000 paid up front today." "I do not have $100,000, I pleaded, my voice cracking with desperation. "I have $38. But I have the truth. Trent is not his son. My father recorded his own confession. If you just take the case on contingency, when we win, you can take a massive percentage of the $80 million. The lawyer offered a sad, pitying smile. "The truth is incredibly expensive to prove in this country," he said softly. "And contingency only works if the money is still there when the fight is over. Your stepmother is bleeding the corporate accounts dry as we speak. By the time I could force her into a courtroom, the $80 million will be sitting in a bank in the Cayman Islands. I cannot risk my firm's resources on a ghost hunt. I am truly sorry. I suggest you sign whatever settlement they offer you and walk away before they completely destroy your life. I was rejected by 20 different law firms. No one would touch the case. I was a man standing in front of a massive, heavily armored tank holding a wooden stick asking someone to help me fight. I was completely, entirely alone. But the absolute depths of my despair had not even been reached yet. Sylvia wanted to make sure I did not just walk away. She wanted to make sure I was completely eliminated as a threat. A week after the $20 million lawsuit was filed, I was sitting in the front seat of my freezing Subaru. The heater was still broken. I was wrapped in a cheap sleeping bag eating a cold sandwich I had bought from a gas station. My phone rang. The caller identification blocked the number. I answered it, my hands numb from the freezing temperature inside the car. "Hello, Harrison?" Sylvia's voice poured softly through the speaker. It was smooth, rich, and dripping with absolute victory. "Leave me alone." "Sylvia," I whispered, too exhausted to even raise my voice. "You took the company. You took the money. You filed the lawsuit. You have everything you ever wanted. Just leave me alone." "Oh, I am afraid we are far past the point of leaving you alone," Sylvia replied, letting out a dark, elegant little chuckle. "You see, Trent and I were reviewing the corporate cybersecurity logs today. We discovered something incredibly disturbing. It appears that someone illegally hacked into your father's private medical records 3 weeks before he died. Someone manipulated his digital files to insert a completely fabricated history of a vasectomy. And then that same person used sophisticated audio software to forge a voice recording to match those stolen files." My blood ran completely cold. The sandwich fell from my trembling hand onto the floorboard. "What are you talking about?" I demanded, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "The recording is real. The medical files are real. You know they are real." "I know no such thing," Sylvia said, her voice dropping into a terrifyingly calm, deadpan tone. "What I know is that my highly paid digital forensics team is currently drafting a comprehensive report. This report proves that you, Harrison Caldwell, committed federal wire fraud, digital identity theft, and criminal conspiracy to defraud an estate. We are handing this report over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation tomorrow morning." I could not breathe. The walls of the small freezing car felt like they were closing in on me, crushing my chest. They were not just suing me anymore. They were fabricating digital evidence to frame me for a federal crime. "When the federal agents arrest you," Sylvia continued her words, driving like physical nails into my skull, "you will not be facing a civil penalty. You will be facing 20 years in a federal penitentiary for defrauding an $80 million corporate entity. You will lose your paramedic license. You will lose your freedom. You will spend the rest of your pathetic life rotting in a concrete cell." "You cannot do this," I gasped, tears of pure, terrified frustration burning in my eyes. "You cannot just invent a crime and send me to prison. I can do absolutely anything I want," Harrison Sylvia stated coldly. "I have $80 million. You are sleeping in a rusted car. The justice system does not care about the truth. It cares about who writes the checks." She paused, letting the sheer, terrifying weight of her threat settle completely over my mind. "I am going to offer you one single final opportunity to survive this," Sylvia said. "I have instructed my legal team to draft a full surrender agreement. You will sign a legally binding confession stating that you forged the DNA clause and the audio recording. You will formally renounce any and all claims to the Caldwell name and the estate. You will publicly apologize to Trent. If you sign this document by tomorrow evening, I will drop the $20 million defamation suit, and I will not hand the federal fraud evidence over to the authorities. You will walk away with nothing, but you will keep your freedom." I sat there in the freezing dark, listening to the woman who had destroyed my family offer me the terms of my total surrender. "If you do not sign it," Sylvia whispered, her voice like ice, I will have you arrested before the weekend. Think about it, Harrison. Think about how cold a federal prison cell is going to feel." The line clicked and went completely dead. I dropped the phone. It clattered against the center console. I pulled my knees up to my chest, wrapped my arms around my legs, and buried my face in the dark, damp fabric of my sleeping bag. I was completely broken. I had reached the absolute, undeniable bottom of the abyss. My father was dead. The woman I loved had abandoned me because of my debts. I was living in my car, eating gas station food. And now I was being forced to publicly confess to a federal crime I did not commit simply to avoid being thrown into a cage by the people who had stolen my entire life. I had no lawyer. I had no money. I had no power. Sylvia was right. The system belonged to her. The truth did not matter when you were going up against an army of corporate sharks who could fabricate evidence out of thin air. I looked out the frosted window of my car at the dark, empty streets. The despair was so heavy it felt like a physical sickness in my stomach. I was going to have to sign the paper. I was going to have to let them win. I could not fight a federal fraud charge with $38. I could not go to prison. I had to surrender my father's legacy to the monsters who had poisoned his life. I reached forward with a trembling hand and put the key into the ignition of my Subaru. The engine turned over, coughing and rattling loudly in the quiet night. I put the car in gear and slowly pulled out of the parking lot. I did not know where I was driving. I just needed to move. I needed to drive until the gas tank was completely empty. As I drove aimlessly through the desolate, rain-slicked streets of the industrial district, passing abandoned warehouses and chain-link fences, my headlights swept across a large, rusted metal sign leaning against a brick wall. The sign read, "Miller Scrapyard." I slammed my foot on the brake pedal. The car skidded slightly on the wet pavement before coming to a complete stop. I sat there in the middle of the empty road staring at the dark, terrifying graveyard of crushed cars and rusted metal stretching out behind the chain-link fence. The Miller Scrapyard. It was the exact location Attorney Sterling had read from the will. It was the place where my father had left my single, worthless inheritance. The 1978 Ford F-150 pickup truck. I stared through the rain-splashed windshield at the dark, imposing gates. My mind was completely numb. I was facing federal prison. I was facing total financial ruin. I was hours away from signing a document that would completely erase my existence. Coming here made absolutely no logical sense. Looking at a piece of junk metal was not going to save me from Sylvia's corporate lawyers. But as I sat there shivering in the cold, the memory of my father pulling me up into the cab of that old truck when I was a little boy suddenly flashed through my mind. I remembered the smell of the old leather seats. I remembered the sound of the engine. It was the only pure, untainted memory I had left of a time before the money poisoned everything. I slowly turned the steering wheel and pulled my car up to the chained gates of the scrapyard. I did not know what I was looking for. I only knew that before I surrendered my entire life to Sylvia Caldwell tomorrow evening, I needed to touch the last piece of my father's true memory. I needed to see the worthless gift that had made Trent laugh so hard. I turned off the engine, stepped out into the freezing night air, and walked toward the dark, rusted gates, completely unaware that the key to my salvation was quietly waiting for me in the dark. I stepped out of my rusted Subaru and stood in front of the massive chain-link gates of the Miller scrapyard. The freezing rain from the previous day had finally stopped, leaving behind a bitter, biting cold wind that cut right through my damp uniform jacket. I was completely exhausted. My muscles ached from pulling back-to-back paramedic shifts, and my mind was entirely fractured by the events of the last few days. Sylvia had just threatened me over the phone with 20 years in a federal penitentiary. She had unleashed a team of high-priced corporate lawyers to completely bury me under a $20 million defamation lawsuit. She demanded my absolute unconditional surrender by tomorrow evening. She wanted me to sign a document confessing to crimes I did not commit and erasing my name from the Caldwell family forever. I had $38 to my name. I had no lawyer. I had no home. But before I surrendered to her blackmail, I had to see the only physical thing my father had legally left me. I walked through the heavy iron gates. The scrapyard was a massive, sprawling graveyard of crushed steel and shattered glass. Mountains of destroyed vehicles loomed in the dark like mechanical skeletons under the flickering yellow security lights. I walked past the main office. A tired old man sitting behind a dirty glass window checked my legal release form. He did not say a single word. He simply pointed a greasy finger toward the far back corner of the massive lot. I walked through the dark, my heavy work boots sinking deep into the freezing mud and the puddles of dirty engine oil. The smell of raw gasoline and rotting upholstery was absolutely overwhelming. It was the distinct smell of things that the world had completely abandoned. And then, sitting alone under the dim glow of a broken street lamp, I saw it. The 1978 Ford F-150 pickup truck. It looked absolutely terrible. The dark blue paint was heavily oxidized and eaten away by massive patches of brown flaking rust. The heavy tires were completely flat, sinking deeply into the freezing sludge of the scrapyard floor. The front chrome grille was dented and twisted, and a thick layer of wet, rotting autumn leaves covered the windshield. It looked exactly like a piece of garbage. It looked exactly like the worthless, insulting joke that Trent had howled with laughter at in that mahogany boardroom. But as I stood there in the freezing dark, staring at the broken-down machine, I did not see a piece of garbage. I saw my childhood. I slowly walked up to the front of the truck and placed my bare, freezing hand against the rusted hood. The cold metal sent a sharp shock up my arm, but I did not pull away. I closed my eyes, and suddenly I was 10 years old again. I could smell the distinct scent of old leather, spilled black coffee, and pine needles. I could hear the deep, powerful rumbling sound of the massive engine starting up on a crisp Saturday morning. This was the truck my father drove before the commercial real estate empire entirely consumed his soul. This was the exact truck he used to take me fishing at the lake up north long before Sylvia ever stepped foot into our lives and poisoned his mind with her endless toxic greed. I remembered sitting in the passenger seat watching my father laugh and turn up the radio. He used to tell me that a man is measured by what he builds and protects with his own two hands, not by the designer labels on his clothes or the balance in his bank account. Those were the days when he was just my dad, a hard-working man trying to provide for his family long before he became a corporate titan surrounded by vultures. Sylvia and Trent absolutely hated this truck. They despised anything that was not brand new, shiny, and obscenely expensive. Trent drove imported sports cars that cost $250,000. He treated vehicles like disposable toys, wrecking them and buying new ones without a second thought. If Trent had inherited this old Ford, he would have paid the scrapyard owner to crush it into a cube of solid metal right then and there just for a good laugh. He would have filmed it being destroyed to humiliate me even further. But my father did not give it to Trent. He gave it to me. I opened my eyes and looked at the ruined truck. Sylvia wanted me to sign a confession tomorrow evening. She wanted me to surrender my dignity, admit to a fabricated federal fraud charge, and walk away forever to save myself from prison. But as I traced my fingers over the rough, rusted metal, I felt a sudden, massive surge of defiance rising up from the absolute bottom of my empty stomach. I was not going to let this truck rot in the mud. I was not going to let the last pure memory of my father be swallowed by a scrapyard and forgotten. I had absolutely no money. I had no home, but I still had my two hands, and I had my respect for the man who raised me. I walked back to the main office and negotiated with the old man behind the glass. I gave him $20 of my last $38 to let me keep the truck in the corner of the lot and work on it through the freezing night. He looked at me like I was completely insane, but he took the cash and handed me a heavy plastic bucket of rusted tools, a stiff wire brush, and an old manual tire pump. I walked back to the truck and immediately got to work. The temperature dropped significantly below freezing. The bitter wind howled through the mountains of crushed cars, biting at my face and turning my fingers totally numb. I did not care. I threw my ruined paramedic jacket into the bed of the truck and rolled up my sleeves. I started by clearing the rotting leaves and thick layers of grime off the massive hood and the glass windshield. The physical labor was completely exhausting, especially after working consecutive trauma shifts on the ambulance, but it was exactly what I needed. The heavy, repetitive motion was a brutal, punishing distraction from the terrifying reality of Sylvia's legal siege. I used the heavy wire brush to fiercely scrape the thick layers of rust off the wheel wells and the heavy steel bumpers. Every single time I dragged the sharp brush across the metal, my muscles burned with a deep, aching fire. My knuckles were scraped and bleeding, the skin cracking painfully from the bitter cold. But I kept going. I worked like a man possessed by a ghost. I forced freezing air into the flat tires using the old manual hand pump. My lungs burned with every single violent push of the metal handle. I was pouring my sweat, my blood, and my absolute sheer willpower into a machine that the rest of the wealthy elite world had thrown away as trash. This was the ultimate character test. Sylvia and Trent genuinely believed that value only existed in offshore bank accounts, massive corporate portfolios, and luxury penthouses. They thought I was a pathetic, worthless loser for driving an ambulance and living in a cheap rented apartment. They thought throwing me into a junkyard would break my spirit. But standing there in the freezing mud, breathing hard and wiping the thick black grease from my forehead, I realized my father knew exactly who I was. He knew I was the only person in his entire life who would look at a ruined, discarded object and see the hidden fundamental value underneath the dirt. He knew I was the only son who would refuse to walk away from a hard, miserable, unglamorous job. He knew Trent would have abandoned this truck in 5 seconds. He knew I would stay and bleed for it. After 4 grueling hours of intense physical labor on the exterior, the sun began to peek over the jagged, metallic horizon of the scrapyard. The cold morning light illuminated the truck. It was still old and beaten down, but it was no longer buried in the mud. It stood tall on fully inflated tires, the windows wiped completely clean, the heavy steel bumper reflecting the pale light of the dawn. I felt a small, quiet sense of immense pride settling deep in my chest. I walked around to the driver's side and grabbed the chrome door handle. I pressed the button and pulled. The heavy hinges screamed loudly, a harsh metallic groan that echoed across the empty lot, but the door opened. I climbed up into the cabin and sat down heavily on the cracked, faded blue leather bench seat. The air inside smelled incredibly stale, a thick, nostalgic mixture of dust, old motor oil, and dry rot. I ran my exhausted hands over the massive steering wheel. I looked at the old analog dashboard, the faded dials, and the classic radio. I reached forward to open the glove box, hoping maybe there was an old paper map, a forgotten photograph, or a fishing lure left inside from my childhood. I grabbed the small chrome latch and pulled. It did not move. The glove box was completely jammed. I frowned and pulled harder. The small latch clicked, but the heavy metal door of the compartment absolutely refused to open. It felt like it was stuck on something incredibly solid. I assumed the metal had simply rusted shut over the years of neglect. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, turning on the flashlight. I leaned over the bench seat and shined the bright beam of light into the small cracks around the edges of the dashboard. The entire assembly looked strange. The glove box in a 1978 Ford is usually just a thin plastic or lightweight metal shell mounted directly behind the door. But when I looked closer, my breath hitched in my throat. I realized the space behind the door was entirely filled with a solid block of heavily reinforced steel. My heart skipped a beat. A sudden, massive rush of adrenaline flooded my veins, instantly wiping away the freezing cold and the crushing exhaustion from my muscles. I leaned down, twisting my tall body awkwardly into the cramped footwell of the passenger side. I shined the light directly upward behind the dashboard. This was not a factory installation. Someone had completely ripped out the original glove box housing and replaced it with a custom-built, heavily armored steel compartment. It looked like a miniature bank vault, and it was welded directly to the heavy steel frame of the truck chassis with thick professional welding beads. I scrambled backward out of the truck and ran across the mud to the plastic bucket of tools. I grabbed a heavy steel crowbar and a large flathead screwdriver. I sprinted back to the passenger side, my boots slipping wildly on the wet ground. I climbed into the cab and jammed the sharp edge of the steel crowbar straight into the tight seam of the glove box door. I threw my entire body weight against the heavy iron bar. The metal groaned and protested loudly. I pushed harder, gritting my teeth, my breath fogging the cold air inside the cabin. Sylvia's elegant, terrifying voice echoed in my head, threatening me with 20 years in a federal prison cell. Trent's cruel, mocking laughter echoed from the mahogany boardroom, telling me to enjoy my garbage. I pushed with absolutely everything I had left in my body. With a loud, violent crack that sounded like a gunshot, the rusted latch finally snapped in half. The heavy steel door of the custom glove box swung open and hit my knee. I dropped the crowbar on the floorboard and leaned forward. My heart was pounding so fast and so hard it felt like a trapped bird beating against my ribs. The interior of the compartment was completely dark. I reached my trembling, bloodied hand inside. The steel walls were incredibly thick, specifically designed to withstand a massive physical impact or an intense fire. My fingers brushed against something soft resting at the very back of the deep armored box. I grabbed it and pulled it out into the pale morning light pouring through the windshield. It was a heavy, dark velvet pouch tied tightly at the top with a thick leather string. I sat back against the cracked leather seat, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I carefully pulled the leather string loose and opened the velvet pouch. I turned it upside down and dumped the hidden contents directly into the palm of my hand. 2 objects fell out. The first was a long, heavy brass key. It was not a car key or a standard house key. It had an intricate, highly complex pattern of deep security grooves and a large, thick, rectangular head. I recognized it immediately from my early days working security at a major hospital before I became a paramedic. It was a high-security safety deposit box key. It was the exact kind of key used by elite private downtown banks to guard extremely sensitive documents that could not be trusted to a digital server or a home safe. Engraved deeply on the side of the polished brass metal were 3 simple numbers: 402, Box 402. The second object was a small, cheap black burner flip phone. It looked completely out of place sitting next to the heavy, expensive brass key. It was the kind of disposable phone you could buy for $20 in cash at a gas station and throw away the very next day to completely avoid being tracked. I stared at the 2 items resting in my dirty, blood-stained hands. The profound, incredible brilliance of my father's plan hit me like a runaway freight train. He had not left me a piece of garbage. He had left me a vault. My father knew exactly who Sylvia was. He knew she would hire a small army of corporate sharks to freeze his legal assets the second he died. He knew she would use the probate courts to lock the estate in a multi-year legal battle. He knew she would use her temporary executive power to bleed the company dry and completely destroy my life before I could even find a lawyer to fight back. So he took the most important things he possessed, the ultimate legal weapons that could destroy her entirely, and he hid them inside an object she would never ever touch. He hid them inside a rusted, dirty truck that she and Trent considered completely beneath their dignity. They laughed at the truck. They laughed at me for being poor, and in doing so they had handed me the exact physical key to their absolute destruction. I picked up the small black flip phone. My thumb rested on the rubber power button. I pressed it down and held it. For a terrifying second, the screen remained totally black. I prayed the battery had not completely died after sitting in a freezing truck for months. Then, the small screen flickered to life. A bright white light illuminated the dark cabin of the truck. The phone chimed a cheap digital melody. I scrolled through the main menu using the stiff plastic buttons. There were no text messages. There was no call history. I opened the contacts folder. There was exactly one single contact saved in the entire memory of the phone. The name listed on the bright screen was simply the word Vault. Next to the name was a long encrypted string of numbers and a heavily protected numeric PIN code. I stared at the screen, my chest heaving with deep, rapid breaths. The absolute depths of my despair from just a few hours ago had completely evaporated into the cold morning air. Sylvia thought she had cornered me. She thought her $20 million civil lawsuit and her fabricated federal fraud charges were going to successfully force me to sign away my legacy tonight. She thought I was just a broken, terrified paramedic with $38 in his pocket who would easily surrender to her immense power. But as I clutched the heavy brass key in my fist and stared at the glowing screen of the burner phone, I realized I was holding a nuclear bomb. The worthless gift was not an insult. It was a heavily armored shield, and it was a sword. I looked out the wiped windshield of the 1978 Ford pickup truck. The morning sun was finally breaking through the heavy gray clouds, casting a bright golden light over the mountains of crushed metal in the scrapyard. I was not going to sign Sylvia's surrender document. I was not going to run and hide from her lawyers. I was going to take this brass key walk straight into the private bank and completely detonate the $80 million lie she had built. The game was no longer in her hands. The morning sun was fully up by the time I parked my rattling Subaru outside the massive glass and steel facade of the First National Secure Depository in downtown. I had not slept in 3 days. My dark blue paramedic uniform was heavily stained with grease rust and the dried blood of the teenager I had saved on the highway. My knuckles were cut and bruised from breaking open the hidden compartment in the truck. I looked like a man who had crawled out of a grave. But as I walked through the pristine revolving doors, my spine was completely straight. My right hand was buried deep in my jacket pocket, my fingers tightly gripping the heavy brass key. The security guards in the lobby immediately stepped forward to intercept me, their eyes scanning my dirty clothes with obvious suspicion. But the moment I pulled out the brass key with the numbers 402 engraved on the side, their entire demeanor changed. That key belonged to the highest tier of private clients. The senior vault manager, a sharply dressed woman with a cold, professional smile, escorted me down a silent, heavily carpeted hallway. We entered a private elevator that descended deep beneath the city streets. The air grew noticeably colder and smelled of filtered ozone and polished metal. We stepped out into a massive, brilliantly lit vault. The walls were lined with thousands of brushed steel deposit boxes. The manager led me to the fourth row, pointed to box 402, and inserted her master key into the first slot. I stepped forward, my hands trembling slightly, and inserted my father's heavy brass key into the second slot. We turned them at the exact same time. The heavy steel door clicked open with a deep, echoing mechanical thud. The manager gave a polite nod and left me completely alone in the silent, heavily armored room. I pulled the long metal drawer out of the wall and carried it to a private viewing table in the center of the vault. I sat down on the leather chair. My heart was beating so fiercely I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. I opened the lid of the metal box. The very first thing I saw was a thick sealed medical envelope bearing the crest of a highly exclusive private surgical clinic. I tore it open. Inside was the original certified medical record of my father's surgery. It detailed a severe vascular complication that had occurred when he was exactly 35 years old. The documents confirmed that to save his life, the surgeons had to perform a permanent, irreversible vasectomy. There was no margin for error. There was no medical ambiguity. 5 years before Sylvia ever announced she was pregnant with Trent, my father was entirely and permanently sterile. Beneath the surgical report was a heavy plastic evidence bag sealed with a tamper-proof zipper. Inside the bag were several thick strands of gray hair with the roots fully intact. A forensic chain of custody document was attached to the bag, legally certifying that the hair belonged to Richard Thomas Caldwell. It was preserved perfectly for a court-ordered DNA match. My father had provided the absolute undeniable biological proof that I was his only true son and that Trent was a biological impossibility. I placed my hands flat on the polished table, letting the massive weight of the truth wash over me. Sylvia had terrorized my mother, calling her a liar and a cheat. She had spent 20 years convincing the world that I was the bastard. But right here, resting on the table in front of me, was the absolute proof that Sylvia was the true fraud. She had brought another man's child into my father's house and demanded he be treated like the golden heir. But the medical records were only the beginning. My father had not just left me a defense against her lies. He had left me an absolute devastating weapon. Beneath the medical files sat a thick black encrypted hard drive and a stack of printed financial ledgers bound in a heavy leather binder. Resting on top of the binder was a handwritten letter. I recognized my father's sharp, aggressive handwriting immediately. I unfolded the paper, my eyes scanning the heavy black ink. The letter was addressed directly to me. My father wrote that he had known about Sylvia's betrayal for over a decade. He knew she had never loved him. He knew she was only waiting for him to die so she could take full control of the $80 million empire. But what he discovered went far deeper than a simple physical affair. My father had hired the most ruthless, secretive forensic accountants in the country. He had them quietly track every single dollar that moved through Sylvia's personal accounts. The letter explicitly named the man she had been sleeping with. It was an aggressive, high-rolling commercial contractor who had partnered with my father's real estate firm 25 years ago. He was the man who had secretly fathered Trent. For over 2 decades, Sylvia and this contractor had played a long, incredibly patient game of absolute deception. They had smiled in my father's face, eaten at his dinner table, and plotted to completely steal his life's work. They had groomed Trent to step into the chief executive officer position, ensuring that the entire $80 million company would silently pass directly into the hands of the man who had betrayed my father. I opened the heavy leather binder and stared at the forensic accounting reports. It was a masterpiece of financial theft. For the past 10 years, Sylvia and her lover had been systematically bleeding the commercial real estate firm dry. They used Trent's position as chief operating officer to approve massively inflated construction budgets. They created dozens of anonymous offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands and the Bahamas. Every time my father's company broke ground on a new skyscraper or a luxury shopping center, Sylvia and her lover funneled millions of dollars in fake material costs directly into those offshore accounts. While I was pulling consecutive night shifts, drowning in $80,000 of medical debt, trying to save my dying mother, Sylvia and Trent were quietly stealing millions to fund their private tropical vacations and buy their custom sports cars.